And that's it. So, Pete, would you care to unmute yourself and take us down the canals of Alston Moor?
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, here we go. I will just go to share my screen. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to a talk about canals of Alston Moor with a question mark. Is this a mistake, you might say? Have you ever seen a canal on Alston Moor? When Alistair talked to me about doing a talk about canals, I thought, yeah, as you'll see later on, you might think there's not a lot to say about canals in Alston Moor, and you're probably right there in one sense, but I thought we'd just have a bit of light-hearted humour to start with. So this is a picture, as I'm sure a lot of you will know, of a canal, a narrowboat, currently beached at the point it was taken. Yeah, let's think about canals of Alston Moor in a very general sense. So the first question I guess you might want to ask yourself is, what is ideal canal building country? Absolutely flat, plenty of water, easy digging with hand tools, and lots of clay. This is stating the obvious, really, but clearly water, if it's not flat, will run downhill, as we all know. So if we dig an artificial channel, which is the canal, then we want that to be horizontal. Clearly, there are ways of going up and downhill in canal boats by using locks with gates on to gradually move a boat up or downhill. But generally speaking, we want a flat route, absolutely flat. No half a degree slope, nothing, just level. We need plenty of water because if we're going to go up and downhill out of necessity using locks, they consume water as we drop down through a chain of locks. So we need a really constant feed. A lot of canals often feed off a river or something like that at a suitable point, or have reservoirs on hilltops to meet the need, but definitely we need plenty of water. Easy digging with hand tools. Why is that? Because we're talking here about the era of 1760 onwards to about 1830-40. So we've no machines, we've no electricity, we've no explosives, and all the digging is going to be done by people by hand. So we want reasonable country. We don't want hard granite. We'd never get the canal built. So nice soft clay like the Midlands of England on the Midland Plains or down into Cheshire is great stuff. We need clay. Why do we need clay? Well, that's because we need to waterproof this canal. So we haven't got modern synthetics at this time. We've not got concrete. And so the whole of the canal bottom and the sides is lined with quite a thick layer of clay. So we need that nearby so we can lay it into the canal. So if it's a 10-mile canal, we need several clay pits along the way. And the way we make it waterproof is by puddling it, which is we make the clay slightly damp and then we bash it and subject to pressure, walk on it, roll on it, do all sorts of things. And that actually makes a nice waterproof, almost natural layer for a canal. And if it's looked after carefully, that can last 100 years or more. So that's the ideal canal building country. And these are the guys who built canals at this time, called navigators originally, navigating the canal, connection to ships and so on, later abbreviated to navies. And, you know, this is a classic group of guys who were building a canal at one time just after 1800. So that's just really a reminder. There's no machines. It's just manual labor. Okay, so we've got an idea of what we need to build a canal. Let's look at the natural features of Alston Moor. I'm sure many of you who live in Alston Moor will think, okay, why is he putting this list on? But it's worth reminding ourselves. It can be very cold in winter. Yep. It's a bit hilly, so we're not really level. We do have plenty of water most of the time. And we've got a mix of hard and soft rocks. So we're not entirely soft rock area. And we do have some very hard layers of particularly limestone and sandstone, which might get in the way. So question, is this ideal canal building country? Not really. The nearest we ever got to a surface canal to Alston is perhaps a branch of a canal that was proposed to run from Newcastle to Carlisle. In the end, that canal was never built. One of the early railways took its place instead. But as part of that, there was a sort of vague proposal. If we're going to build this Newcastle to Carlisle canal, perhaps we need a branch up to Alston. Because one of the reasons for thinking about that sort of canal and the later railway was the riches of the lead mining products that were coming out of Alston and the Allendales as well. So Alston was a very definite target for a canal, but it never happened. So yeah, time passed, a railway eventually was built instead. So why would you want to build a canal? Yep, good question. Okay, basically it's to improve transport. We're naturally going to make profits, we hope, from both operating the canal and from our business being improved if we're using the canal as a means of transport. Dare I say that, you know, if I'm the engineer of the canal or the guy who's putting the money in, then a bit of fame is useful. Call it publicity, call it marketing. But, you know, some people do feed off things like that. So fame is a very handy thing to have available. And to an extent, there's a fashion. So if we go back to just before 1800, we had an era called in economic history, the canal mania. So the first 2 or 3 canals were built and people saw how profitable they could be. And so started proposing canals all over the place. So there are reasons for building a canal. We might not ever get the canal built, but, you know, we're joining in the contemporary fashion. So plenty of reasons for building a canal. It's worth mentioning that all keep talking about this era before 1800, 1750s, 60s onwards. Don't forget that canals were in existence in all over the world, but particularly, shall we say, in the UK, dating back to, if you like, the 1300s. There was an Exeter Canal. And then, if you like, even the Romans, I believe, built some canals around Lincoln. So, you know, it's not a new invention at the time of the Industrial Revolution, but people had kind of sort of forgotten about it a bit, you might say, or never thought how the idea of canals could be applied to inland travel. Great for just getting down to the sea if you're a few miles up from the seashore on a river, perhaps. And there were lots of navigable rivers, which we might call canals. So why did it all kick off? Well, the reason was that people were moving coal, which was becoming a necessity to develop industry in the 1750s onwards. And also people were making things. The classic one is Josiah Wedgwood, who had built his pottery factory in near Stoke-on-Trent, a long, long way from the sea or big navigable rivers. And he realized that the only way he was going to get his product down the rivers and perhaps exported was to have some cheaper means of transport. So he, for example, was a prime mover in building canals from Stoke-on-Trent down to the River Mersey and so on. So, yeah, it's really about improving transport, and we hope not to make a loss and ideally to make a profit. So let's sum up, you know, how it's worth remembering how we can move things about before, say, roughly 1800. Obviously, a human can carry a certain amount. A pack horse can carry perhaps a couple of sacks slung across the back. We've got horse and perhaps 2-wheel carts. We've got, although I've not listed it there, we've got bigger carts with 4 wheels and perhaps pulled by a couple of bullocks. Or more. And then we hit upon the idea, Mr. McAdam says, hey, we can do things about making roads better, which are essentially graded gravel roads of different sized stones. And that led on to the idea of privately financed roads, if you like, which is what turnpike roads eventually are. And so that's a means of building an improved road by raising private finance, getting an act of parliament. And the first one in our area is the road that's built from Hexham to Alston in 1778, again driven by the mining interests, but not entirely. And of course, railways are starting to appear. If you think about near to us, the northeast coalfield, Newcastle and Sunderland areas, the River Wear and the River Tyne, we've got wooden railways being built a long time before 1800 to shift coal from the mines inland down to the rivers to load onto ships and then export it off to London. So yeah, there are ways of moving stuff around. It doesn't have to be a canal. There are other ways of shifting it. Let's think about the economic reasons for canals. So this is a table from Skempton's Canal and River Navigations. Take a moment to look at it, perhaps. So we're probably interested in this particularly, the barge on a narrow canal. So a barge on a narrow canal, like in my starting picture, can probably carry about 30 tons of material. And it needs one horse to pull that 30 tons. Alongside the canal, you have a towpath and a big rope fastened to the barge, and hey-ho, off we go. If we got an even broader canal, of which, you know, there aren't any near us, but for example, the River Calder down in Yorkshire, connecting the Calder and the Hebble rivers to the sea, they were built a slightly wider canal and they could shift 50 tons with one horse. If we move lower down and we get looking at like an early railway wagon running on iron rails, a horse can pull about 8 tons. A macadam road, the next one down, only 2 tons. Soft roads, hardly half a ton. Pack horse right at the bottom, even less. So you can see the definite advantages from there of having a barge on a narrow canal. And the comparison on the right-hand side is just to give you an idea how many horses you need to draw the same weight by a horse-drawn wagon on a soft road. And it's horrendous, isn't it? And it's worth remembering that I think one of the biggest industries pre the railways was the breeding and production and the feeding of horses and everything that arises from that. You know, the guys who look after the horses, the grooms, the stable guys, the people who farm the land to produce feed for horses and move the feed around and so on. So, you know, horses are okay, but they're expensive things to look after and they're prone to getting ill and they have a limited life, of course. So this is what people are thinking about at the time once they knew about canals. Okay, they're a good idea. You can see why. Just mentioning about different types of canal. So a barge canal boat, quite a wide one, width a couple of meters, 14 feet. And a narrow canal boat, sorry, I've got that wrong way around, haven't I? Yes, apologies for that. That's not right. Yeah, hang on a minute. I'll have to work that out again. But the width of the barge canal boat is clearly wrong there in the metric measurement. So let's stick with the old imperial. So 14 feet wide for the barge canal boat, and the narrow canal boat's only 7 feet wide. So that's something worth thinking about. Perhaps if you've got lots of hard rock, or it's not going to be a very busy canal, or perhaps you haven't got a lot of water, maybe you go for the narrow canal. That is one of the historic problems with canals in the UK, that a lot were subsequently built after this time on the narrow size, 7 foot wide boats. So as things developed, they really did become economic. So the canal usually has to be about twice the width of the boat. So if you have a 7 foot wide boat, we need a 14 foot wide canal. Obviously, the middle of the canal is going to be deeper than the sides, and it's going to sort of slope up to the edges. So at the edges of the canal, it might only be about a foot deep, the water, but in the middle, you want about 7 or 8 feet of water. So let's talk about Alston Moor. What were the industrial transport needs in Alston Moor in the 18th century in particular, because that's what we're really interested in. And the big thing, of course, was lead mining. Okay, there were other things going on. There was stone quarrying and there was farming and so on. But let's just focus on lead mining, because that was the big industry. So we've got the need to transport the material underground from the workplace where we're extracting the minerals to the surface. And from on the surface, once we've processed it, perhaps crushed it and cleaned it up, we need to ship it to our smelting furnaces. And then once we've smelted it in the blast furnace, lots of fire and heat, we need to ship it to the sea and the river wharves for export particularly. And meanwhile, of course, we're consuming things on Alston Moor. So we probably haven't got much timber on Alston Moor, so we're bringing that in, often from the coast. We might be bringing coal in, we're bringing foodstuffs in, we're bringing tallow for candles for the miners, we're bringing iron for tools and so on. So it's a two-way process. So by about 1800, we've got horses working some of these wooden railways underground, pulling the wagons. We've got horses and carts moving the surface material to the furnaces, or more often pack ponies as well, still being used. For example, mineral from Nenthead was still being shipped to Dukesfield near Slaley into about 1820. So quite long hauls by pack ponies. And there's tales there of, 50 or 60 pack ponies in a train, 10 different trains in a day crossing the moors just to ship lead ore perhaps from Nenthead to say Dukesfield. And then once we processed it, we've got this heavy ingot of lead mineral, which we've got to get to somewhere like Brighton on the River Tyne, or perhaps to Stockton to ship it, because a lot of the trade in lead, apart from the UK, was export. And if you read about the Blackett family, who later on became the developers of the mines in Allendale, already they developed a massive export trade to Holland particularly. And of course, as we said, we're bringing supplies into Alston Moor as well. So it's a two-way traffic. So that's our need. Okay, so that's what we need transport for. So various people came along, mining entrepreneurs, you might say, with lots of money, they thought, we're going to make a lot of money. The price of lead, 1750, 60 onwards till about 1810 is reasonably high. It's very economic and there are profits to be made if you can find the lead underground. And canals are all the vogue. We talked about the canal mania earlier. And so the idea of building canals underground was a natural follow on, you might say. Okay, so we've got these surface canals, we've got these horses, we've got these railways underground perhaps, so we've got guys just pushing wheelbarrows. Why don't we do our canals underground? Makes sense if we've got the money. So I've listed three there, which are the three we know of really. So Nentforce at Alston to Middleclough, which is the headwaters of the River Nent, southeast of Nenthead, 1776, the idea starts. We've got Middle Crag, which is north of Garrigill on the Tyne, to Lee House, which is further south at the opposite end of Garrigill, 1778. And we've got Nentsbury, halfway between Alston and Nenthead, to Greengill. Greengill's sort of almost due south of Nentsbury. It's on the high watershed between Nenthead and Garrigill. So they're the three we know of. And I use the word canal carefully here because, as I'll come on to say later, perhaps the Nentsbury to Greengill and the Middle Crag to Lee House were not entirely going to be canals, but I think that's debatable. So developing what we said about the methods of transport, let's particularly apply it to mines and canals and so on. Another little table. You can see there that a pack horse can carry 200 or 300 weights. A coupe, which is a two-wheel cart at the time, can carry about 800 weights. A wain, which is a four-wheeled bullock or horse-pulled cart, can carry about 1700 weights. A rail wagon on wooden rails can carry 5,300 weights. And a narrow barge on a narrow canal can carry up to 600 weights, all apart from the wain needing one horse. So obvious great economies of scale possible here. So you can see the attraction if you're the entrepreneur thinking, if I can find the money and build myself a narrow barge canal, I can ship a lot of stuff for a lot less money. And remember, your horses are one of your biggest expenditures at the time. So look at the specific places we know about. So Nentsbury to Greengill. The company that was interested in this area had a mining lease started in 1778, and they were there till 1798. Now, looking at the evidence on the ground and what we know from very few historical sources, it's fairly certain they probably never started to drive the canal tunnel underground there. There is a mine at it in roughly the right location, but it's a normal size mine that you would find everywhere else in Alston Moor in the North Pennines. So, okay, fairly sure that one probably never started. Middle Crag to Lee House, again, the same period, actually the same company as the last one we were just looking at. William Wallace, who was a guy who worked for the mining company in the 1800s, wrote a book in 1890, a sort of general history with quite a lot of detail. And he actually says that this canal was started to be driven at Beldy, which is close to the river at Garrigill, very near to the bridge over the river at Garrigill on the east side. And he remarks on the fact that the tunnel was driven 2.7 by 2.7 meters. Clearly that's, you know, your big size in order to get your narrowboat in. And he remarks that the work was abandoned because the rock was very hard and very expensive to mine. So if you think about different rocks we get around here, we've got like the soft shales and sandstones, which are a bit harder. Then we've got the limestones as well, which are harder still. And in parts of Alston Moor and the rest of the North Pennines, we've got what a rock called a wind sill, which is essentially a volcanic rock, which is a lot harder. And so where the engineer had decided to build this tunnel, the required depth below the surface, they found they were driving their tunnel in this very hard rock. And Wallace says that basically they just gave up. It was costing too much. And if you think about it as well, the context is that perhaps if you're lucky, in a softer rock, you might drive a yard a day. In a very hard rock, you're probably driving less than half a yard a day, maybe even less. So it's going to take a long time and cost a lot of money. So yeah, perhaps they did start. The interesting thing about this tunnel and the previous one, which is this one, the Nentsbury to Greengill one, is that there is a plan in existence in the archives which shows the proposed run of these two tunnels for canals, and it actually labels them as SOUGH, that's S-O-U-G-H, which is a mining term very much used in Lancashire and Derbyshire and other places. And essentially a SOUGH is a drainage tunnel to get the water out of the mine. And in quite a lot of parts of England, a SOUGH is driven quite small, not even big enough hardly for somebody to walk upright. Definitely never get a horse in it, definitely never get a canal boat in it. So it's debatable whether they were ever going to be full-size canals. Perhaps they changed their mind even after they'd found this difficult rock to drive in at Garrigill. But I guess we'll never know that. I expect you could say the meaning of words changes over time, and perhaps I'm making a misinterpretation there as well. But I think that's significant that they were really seeking to drain the mines in the first place. And hey, why don't we make them into canals as well until we find out how expensive they are? So, third one on the list was from the Nent Force at Alston to Middleclough, south of Nenthead. So they start driving this one in 1776, and it goes on for an awful long time into the 1800s. And it's actually built, completed from Alston at the Nent Force to Nentsbury as a canal. It then carries on later on as time goes by from Nentsbury to Nenthead as a normal mine at it, a much smaller tunnel. And then the bit from Nenthead to Middleclough is never ever built in the way that it was originally planned. So this bit from Alston Nentsbury as a canal they had a lot of trouble. You can read various historic sources. There's a couple of main sources, but essentially they're all working off the same archive, which is the archive in the Public Records Office and elsewhere about the Greenwich Hospital estate, who were the landowners at the time. And it's obvious from time to time their engineering was not very good, or surveying, and so they weren't driving it absolutely horizontal. Remember, you know, the canal's got to be level, so they're having to like dig the floor out to get the levels back down again, so it was actually operate as a canal. So it didn't go very well. Here we've got a map to give you an idea. So if we go, oops, sorry, hang on a minute. Where have I gone? I've lost myself. Right, sorry about that. So in this area here, Middle Crag, on the left-hand side, we've got where the arrow is pointing at the blue dotted line, just to the north of Garrigill, and you can see the approximate proposed line of the canal tunnel that they were going to build. And somewhere about here is where they did actually start to drive at Beldy, just next to Garrigill. So that's one place. Here's the Nentsbury one on this side in the Nent Valley, just opposite the houses at Nentsbury where the pub used to be. So it's on the southwest side of the river and heading up to here to Greengill, high on Nunnery Hill. And then right up at this end here, we've got in the gorge below Alston town, we've got the Nentforce level entrance, and the solid blue line right up to Nentsbury here is showing you the bit they actually did manage to build as a canal. And then the dotted blue line carrying on right up onto what is actually Nenthead Common up here, is where it was planned to go. So that's what they were planning to do, all these folk. Grand schemes, you know, big things. Let's just go sideways a bit and say, okay, we've talked about, you know, the theory of canals and the practice and all the big ideas, but why were they actually proposed for our minds up in Alston Moor? Need to step aside a bit and think about the Bridgewater Canal. So the Bridgewater Canal was built to the west of Manchester, and it runs right into the centre of Manchester. And the reason it was built was to carry coal from coal mines to the middle of Manchester. So you've got a big domestic demand for house heating in Manchester, and you've also got cotton mills, massive cotton mills. You know, was Manchester the first industrial city and so on. And they were built originally on using water power in the rivers in Manchester, but increasingly they were starting to switch to steam engines as well. And the guy who owned the mines to the west of Manchester, which decided that he could produce more coal and make a lot more money if he had a way of getting this coal direct to Manchester. And his mines were not very deep below the surface. So the canals actually started underground, came out of the coal mine onto the surface and then along to Manchester. Took a lot of money, and he sort of had to borrow and mortgage property and so on. But eventually the canal was built and opened, and in a very short period of time, he got his money back and was in profit. Now, a guy called James Gilbert, who was a local from that area, was a manager, if you like, a land agent, perhaps you might call him now, for the owner of the mine. And he became an investor in the mining company at Alston with several other rich folk. Why they were attracted to the area, we're not quite sure. I think that's grounds for somebody to do a lot of research. But he brought that expertise of building that canal underground from Manchester, and he brought it to Alston. And he was clearly an advocate. When you read the few snippets of published stuff about his letters and so on, he thought canals were the big thing. And obviously, he's a consultant in our modern day speak. And well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he had a successful venture on the Bridgewater Canal at this place, Worsley, and things were going great and they were making a lot of money. And people thought there was a lot of money generally to be made in lead mining at the time. It was a period of a lot of investment going on. quite often without much return, but they weren't to know that at the time they started. And so here's Worsley, which is the place where the canal came out from underground, from the coal mines, and then ran on the surface. And these were the boats they used at this particular coal mine. And you can see they're relatively small. I'm sorry there isn't a person on the picture or a horse or a scale, but you get the idea. They're quite narrow to fit in the canal tunnels underground, and they obviously weren't at full capacity. They weren't going to carry, what was it, 600 hundredweights of coal. But you can, if you look at that picture there and think about it, you can see how somebody could think, well, we could build a canal for a lead mine. It's quite feasible, and here's the design for a boat, which will just fit nicely in quite a narrow tunnel. This is underground in the coal mines at Worsley, in one of these canals, which are still there. This is a picture taken about 20 years ago, and these tunnels are in reasonable condition. You can see all the brick arches here, and they're still inspected regularly, because obviously if they collapse, you've got a lot of subsidence in that area of Lancashire. So very successful. They even conquered the idea of going uphill and downhill underground. So the canal boats were dragged out of the water and lowered on railway track down inclined planes underground. So you could cope with the fact that, you know, the coal seams are at different heights in the rock underground. So again, thinking about all that, you can see how that technology could be transferred to a lead mine. And here you have one of the classic known pictures of the mine, the Nenthead mine at Alston, the entrance a long time ago. I think it's said to be about 1900, and a couple of boats. Now those boats, to my mind, are clearly not like the pictures of the boat we were looking at Worsley. But yeah, the one on the left looks pretty big, doesn't it? Quite a monster. One on the right looks more the sort of boats you might be using to do inspections and so on. When you think about it as well, there are obvious problems, aren't you, of building a canal underground, because when the boat comes out and full of whatever you've got in it, waste rock or the lead mineral, you've then got to get it out the boat by shoveling it by hand and load it onto something else. Whereas if they'd used railway, even then they would have found it easy, because you can tip a railway wagon up and empty it. So yes, canals boats can shift a lot of weight to be pulled by one horse, but on the other hand, they bring their own difficulties, you might argue. One of the interesting things about canals in general, not just specifically our Nenthead canal at Alston, is that quite often horses were not used underground in tunnels and so on. What happened was you build a tunnel to a certain size. So if we're the man in charge of the boat, we can lay on our back somewhere on top of the boat on a suitable platform, and using our feet on the roof of the tunnel or the side, we can propel the boat along. And surprisingly, one man can move a laden canal boat underground. If you've got two, it's a bit easier. But once you've got the boat going, it's fairly easy, apparently, to keep it going. And what we understand from the actual evidence of people writing about the Nenthead is that the method they adopted was to put sticks, if you like, or poles, stuck sideways in the side of the actual tunnel, and use those to propel the boat along. So you must have sort of sat down in the boat or stood up and sort of pulled it along on these poles sticking out the side. So it actually happened. They built it, and it was full of water and so on. Let's just step back a minute to Middle Crag and Nentsbury. As I've said, they were part of speculative mining enterprises. Why go for Greengill particularly? Well, it had been a very large producer of lead mineral for the Blacketts in that 1670, 1690 period. And our company, which were interested, actually thought, I think, probably that, yeah, this could be a good mine. Let's go deeper down, drive our canal tunnel. Guess what? They didn't really find anything, even without driving the canal. So they gave up. And so that never happened. Same thing at Middle Crag, because as we said, they realized it was going to be very expensive to drive their canal tunnel. So they never bothered. And the company that had the lease, that were thinking about these two canals, basically just walked away. So they invested a lot of money, didn't get the returns. I think some people might say they broke even, and they gave up the leases, and other mining companies then took them over. Nenthead was different. Now, it wasn't the mine company that provided the funding and the drive and determination to get this tunnel built. It was actually the Greenwich Hospital Estate, who of course were the landowner at the time. And let's remind ourselves that the Greenwich Hospital Estate was a London-based organisation. Yes, they owned lots of land up around Alston Moor and up into Northumberland and so on. And they were getting quite a lot of income from that, which of course was the idea, that they were given all this landholding by the government of the time so that the money that it brought in, the profits, could be used to finance the Greenwich Hospital for Seamen in London. Great. And of course, you don't know anything about mining. You're in London and you've got these guys who we would call consultants who are going around saying, yeah, excellent. Yeah, this is a good idea. By the way, have you thought about this? And remember, you know, it's like these people are experts, these consultants, so we'll trust them and believe them. And my view is that what happened was they were looking to increase their income quite properly, and they were taking the relevant advice, and there were people around like the guy we just talked about from Worsley, who'd been the land agent there, and there were other people brought in to help with running the Greenwich Hospital Estate, including the famous engineer Smeaton and so on. And they all said the same thing from what we can read, as far as we know, in the archives that people have dug into and quoted, which was, yes, excellent idea, good idea to build one of these canals. So naturally, you take the engineer's advice. And so the original objective was that by building this tunnel all the way from Alston to Nenthead, we're bound to find some new mineral deposits. So we'll get more profits, we'll get more rents for the landowners. But in truth, they found very little new mineral. So they drove a long way, which we'll see shortly, and found very little. They started off driving it with a railway. And then John Gilbert said, well, you know, much better idea if you drove it as a canal. So it started off as a railway, perhaps a wooden one, maybe using early cast iron rails, not very big, but big enough to get a horse and a railway wagon in, perhaps something like 2-foot gauge railway track. And you read in the accounts that have been published that very soon they were lifting up the railway track and widening the tunnel out and making it horizontal so they could flood it and use it as a canal. So a lot of capital costs, a lot of delay, where in effect we keep rebuilding it and re-engineering it. It's my view that the Bridgewater Canal at Worsley succeeded because it had very large reserves of coal, went on for a long, long time, and they've got this guaranteed market in Manchester. And to an extent, mining coal is fairly predictable. You know, once you've done your boring and drilling and found out where the coal is, you know that a certain tonnage is available and you're going to be able to get it out, so, unless it's an absolute disaster. And so it's a different thing to lead. Now, lead mining is a very unpredictable trade to be in. You might go for years and find next to nothing and spend all your capital, and then a week later you suddenly break into a bonanza of very rich lead ore, and vice versa. You might start off with a very rich lead mine, and then as the years go on, you find that it's run out. And the volumes of material you're excavating are a lot smaller than in a coal mine. So yeah, great idea to have a canal in a coal mine. Undoubtedly, it worked and people made the profit. So there's the proof. But I think with lead mining, it was always going to be more difficult. That's a personal view of mine, of course. You get things like this. Now, Sopwith in 1833 writes a book. Now, Sopwith is a guy who eventually becomes the manager of all the mines at Allen Heads and Coal Clough and in Allendale. And he's a very clever guy in the true sense of the word, you know, and knows a lot about different sciences. And this is what he writes, that it was commenced and directed by Smeaton. That's a bit like what you might read in the papers today. It wasn't just Smeaton, there were other people involved. Didn't produce the results, sound judgment and proprietary of the design, etc. But hang on, folks, we haven't yet got to the most productive part of the manor at Nenthead. So fact, isn't it? So the most productive part of the manor of Alston Moor when it comes to lead mining is basically within a mile or two of Nenthead, which is, when he wrote this in 1833, they hadn't got the actual tunnel from Nenthead, it hadn't got to Nenthead. And you can see what he ends with. Stupendous work may open out a world of wealth. Now, change the time, change the place, and you will see reports like this in lots of mining prospecti over the years. And quite often, you know, the profits were nil. So that's classic typical. Now, this map is an extract from another book that the guy Wallace wrote that we mentioned earlier. Now, Wallace was, he wrote this book in 1856, from which this map comes. And he was an employee of the mining company at Nenthead, the London Lead Company. And he was quite a clever guy, I think, and he started to think a lot. And he produced this map in the back of a book, which he got published, which must have been quite something for a guy who was one of the deputy managers, you might say, at Nenthead, to actually have a book published in 1856. So going to our left-hand corner here, we're just above Alston in the Nenthead, and here's the entrance to the level, and the blue dotted line running up the map shows you where the Nenthead level was actually built as a canal. So it's closely following roughly the course of the River Nent. And a good question is, okay, why did they do that? Why didn't you just drive a straight line from Alston to Nenthead? So left-hand side, bottom left of the picture, middle of the right, let's just drive a straight line. No reason. However, if you're thinking about a mine, you need things like supplies, you need ventilation, and so on. So the reason why it's following the river is to get to the lowest point in the valley, so we can sink vertical shafts into the tunnel as we go along, and perhaps even sink them ahead of where we are with the Nenthead tunnel, so we can speed up the work and we can get air in as well. So that's why it's following the valley, and it dodges about a bit, but basically great. So that's the actual canal section from Alston to Nenthead. And looking at the map, what this map is actually showing you, apart from the river and the outcrops of rock, is the run of all the fault lines, the geological faults, the brown lines, and the yellow and red and blue lines, which are also geological faults, but that's where the mineral is. So the blue is the really rich parts of the mine, and the red is the second most richest, and the yellow least so. No red, no yellow, no blue, no lead. So you can see why, to an extent, people thought it would be a good idea to drive this tunnel, because on the north side, we've got, as you come up to Blaegill, you'll see Blaegill mines listed there. We've got lots of red and blue, and on the hillside there, Thorngill mine. And then as we come round to the east, the right-hand side of the map, you'll see Hudgill Burn vein written on the south side of the river. Very, very rich mine by the time, not known when they started to drive this tunnel, but later on, by about 1820-30, it's proven to be a very rich mine. So sound reasons for driving this tunnel, and so on, and why not? This is the next bit. So left-hand side of the map, we're at Nenthead. On the right-hand side, you can see we're at Nenthead. If you look closely on the right-hand side of the map, you'll see a black line with a number 32 on it, which is, when I get me just about here, so around here, and that's the smelting mill at Nenthead. And so you can see the blue dotted line again coming across the middle of the map is showing how the tunnel was actually driven. So what happened was, when they got to Nenthead on the left-hand side of our map, it was getting a bit expensive, and they really hadn't found very much, and it was obviously costing the Greenwich Hospital a lot of money relative to their income, and they would be having second thoughts. The guys who'd originally okayed it in 1776, I don't know, maybe they were no longer around on the committee down in London, so they took a sort of a view and decided enough's enough. but we're going to carry on driving to Nenthead. We've got to finish it. You know what it's like in a big organization. You've got to carry on once you've started. It's a bit like losing face and so on. So they carry on. But this section here that we're looking at from Nentsbury to Nenthead is not driven as a canal. They actually go up the mine shaft at Nentsbury, which goes right to the surface there, and they drive their tunnel to Nenthead about halfway up the mine shaft. And it's just an ordinary, you might say, mine tunnel like the rest of the mines around Alston and Nenthead. Same thing though, it follows the bottom because it's looking for shafts, and it ends up at Nenthead, right next to the village, where there's a deep shaft so they can get ventilation and resources and so on. So it didn't deliver on the product, which was to find new mines where they could produce lead ore, and therefore the Greenwich Hospital rents and profits would go up. So it failed, but it did provide unforeseen benefits. So it acted as a drain for a hydro plant, which a later mining company built from 1903 onwards and worked until the 1950s. And that allowed this mining company to, if you like, have very green, in modern jargon, power generation methods. And so the water falling down this 300-foot deep shaft at the end of the Nenthead level could drive Pelton wheels and turbines, flow down the tunnel all the way to Nentsbury, fall down the shaft there, and then drain all the way out of the tunnel to Alston. So that was a big bonus. So original purpose not fulfilled, very expensive way, you might say, of building a hydro station, would never have been done otherwise, but it did have a use. And the water today still continues to drain from all the mine workings at Nenthead and en route back to that outlet at Alston. So what's the future of this Nenthead level, the only canal that was ever built underground around Alston? Okay, way back in the 18th and 19th century, and I think maybe not in the 20th century, it was a bit of a tourist attraction. At times people did go in the canal bit in boats, and as some of you will know who've been around a while, there was a proposed scheme to get the funding to actually reopen it in the 20th century and have boat trips up the Nenthead level. That scheme didn't raise the cash it needed to do it. There's been thoughts about using it as part of the water treatment schemes that have been proposed for cleaning up the pollution from the mines that we have around here, like the scheme that's been just being built at Nentsbury now by the Coal Authority for the Environment Agency. So that was one suggestion. Why not use this Nenthead level as a big tunnel to move all the water around? I think that sort of probably never got off the starting blocks, because you imagine the cost nowadays of basically going into a 5-mile tunnel, Alston to Nenthead, which built in 1776, hasn't really been maintained since the 1950s. Basically, you have to start opening it out. The costs would be incredibly immense. One of the other suggestions was, well, we could use all these mine shafts like the old mine company did to generate hydropower under the sort of current government green schemes that may be around. But again, it's the same problem. You're discharging all your wastewater into the Nenthead tunnel. What if there's a roof fall and it blocks and it gets backed up? So you've got to do something about maintaining it. Again, it would be a very expensive scheme. We know already from the exploration that has taken place at various times, mine explorers over the years have gone in from the entrance at Nenthead or gone down some of the shafts. There's a lot of blockages. So the water is getting away, but there's a lot of work needs to be done. And the other thing as well is that riverbank erosion, as we go down the Nent, particularly at Four Shield, was getting very, very near to where the mine shaft is on the riverbank. So that's not the first time that's happened. It happened in the 19th century as well. So again, long-term problem. What if the river gets into the mine? It's then going to come out at Nenthead down above the railway station in greater quantity. So lots of practical difficulties for the future. So the first two canals, the other two were never built at Garrigill and at Nentsbury, but the Nentforce Canal Tunnel was built to Nentsbury from Alston, and it's still there. 1776, about 1840 odd, it gets to Nenthead. So yeah, it's still being used. The shaft at the end at Nenthead is an education resource, very much enjoyed by visitors. Climbing down that shaft, the 300 foot, is a bit of a sporting challenge, but experienced climbers can do it. And now the surface buildings are protected and it's a scheduled ancient monument. Interestingly enough, of course, the entrance to the Nentforce level was quarried away because it happened to be under some nice, useful limestone. And so all we have now at the entrance is a bit of a pipe discharging into the river and nothing much else to see. So I end with this picture, which is looking down the final shaft on the Nentforce level at Nenthead. And that, if you like, is what's left of the Nentforce in terms of what you can easily see. And so that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was useful.
Oh, thank you, Peter. It's gosh, from the sort of aspirations to the failure. But was it a failure? I'm thinking you mentioned that the Nentforce level did serve the purpose of draining the mines above. Did it bring any mines into profitability that would have had to be drained and made, would they have been unprofitable due to water ingress without the Nentforce level? Do you know?
Yes, at Hoodgill, one new mine was discovered, which is below the valley floor, and the Nentforce level did drain that, but it wasn't a vastly large mine in terms of its production. And yes, at Nenthead, it's sort of 200 feet below the valley floor, and so did drain some of the mines there as well, but not to any significant extent.
No, I think we're all just taking it in.
Okay, I'll just wave that.
Oh, sorry, Simon, yeah?
Peter, I was wondering, there's a shaft between Nenthall Hotel and Four Shield, and Maureen Sayer once told me on a walk there. So that's on the flat land, some distance from Nentsbury itself. And she told me a tale of them trying to put a Pelton wheel down to the bottom of it to generate electricity. I think for Lovelady Shield, I'm not sure. And apparently they were lowering it down and down and down, and the rope broke, and it's in pieces at the bottom. Now, have you heard that story? Is it true? Have I made it up? Did Maureen make it up? What's the crack?
Yes, it's a story. Yes, I've heard it, and it is said to be true. Yeah. A guy called Peter Wilkinson, who's written the definitive book about the Nentforce level in recent years, his team, he was in a mining exploration group, and I think they did descend that shaft and found some wreckage, but they couldn't get to the bottom of it. So yes, it's supposed to be factual that that's what happened.
Well, I've also heard that I've actually seen the people who did it. By what we call Happy Steve's house, which is very close to the Horse and Wagon, that's a huge shaft, isn't it, down there?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And there's one story about Joe Richardson having to go into an engine there, inside a piston of an engine, and decoke it as a child, a little boy going in. And the other story, which has never been told in public, which is a group of possibly drug-addled, drunken young people did on one occasion get together and throw lots of things down the shaft, and to wait to see how long it takes down to get them on. This is like a telegraph pole and a television. And I've had the man who took the photograph sitting next to me in this very office, but I won't name him.
About 3 or 4 years ago, with the advent of good waterproof video cameras, one was lowered down the shaft at Nentsbury, and there is a video available. And unfortunately, as it gets lower and lower down, and it encounters the water that's draining from the mine at Nenthead, which sort of appears about halfway up the shaft, eventually all you can see is a lot of water falling. But yes, so you can't really see what's at the bottom.
In the Nenthead level?
I don't know.
Oh,
Remember, it's a bit of a legend about it being Smeaton's design, right? He was one of the sort of consultants, if you like, in my words, that the Greenwich Hospital employed to advise them what to do. But he didn't work alone when it came to the Nenthead level. There's various other people involved. They had a local manager who managed the land around Alston called the Moor Master, who was also responsible for overseeing all the mining that was going on. So Smeaton was involved, yes, but he wasn't alone.